Before I start this video, let me just remind you that I have a new account for all of my anime content and I started up my own comedy channel. With that being said, let's get back to the video. In World War I, Russia is ruled by one of the last absolute monarchs in all of Europe. Its one advantage against Germany is making the Tsar increasingly unpopular. Having a bigger army, Russian soldiers are being killed at an alarming rate. These are men who are husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, and Russia is being blockaded, causing many Russians to starve to death. The increasing dissatisfaction eventually caused the Tsar to abdicate in what we today call the February Revolution. A regime that we today call the provisional government took over. And since Russia continued to fight World War I under the provisional government, which had no end in sight, Russia was still losing badly, causing many more people to starve to death. The provisional government would end up being overthrown by the Bolsheviks, who would surrender to the Central Powers in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But this begs the question, why didn't the provisional government just surrender and save Russia from the Bolsheviks and continue to industrialize Russia so that it can be prepared for large-scale warfare, unlike in World War I? Here's what would have happened and why they couldn't have industrialized without another revolution happening, in 5 reasons. First is because of its currency. Inflation had spiraled out of control by the time of the February Revolution, despite substantial inflows of foreign subsidies, around 6% a month from the constant currency emissions. And there wasn't remotely enough gold to honor currency exchanges if they were ever reopened. Purchasing power by the February Revolution was a merely 30% of what it had been before the war. For a country that was already capital poor and with a low standard of living, this was economically crippling, as any domestic savings had seen their value plummet. The lower and middle classes whose wages did not keep up had to spend more and more on food just to survive. Increased labor unrest and the breakdown of effective tax collection only exasperated the problem, as the government selling fewer and less valuable bonds and collecting less taxes meant less money sucked out of the economy and the need for ever more money printing to cover the budget and service outstanding debt. Speaking of debt, here's reason 2. Even before the war, Russia had the largest national debt in the world and gorged itself on high levels of foreign investments. Since foreigners owned nearly all the oil wells and mines in the country, around half of both base-level heavy industries of chemicals and metalworking, half of the government debt and value of the stock market was owned by foreign financial interests, and as the debt were not denominated in rubles, inflation has minimal impact on their real value. By the time of the February Revolution, their foreign debt had more than tripled, which was dramatically more than the real value they had been able to borrow on the already exhausted domestic market. The British and French aren't only going to stop their subsidies to the provisional government after this cowardly betrayal in surrendering to the Germans, especially since their one source of legitimacy was a vague sense of continuity from the Tsarist government whose agreements they were spitting on. So there would be a fire sale in Russian securities and a demand that the massive outstanding debt that had been building up for decades begin to be repaid in hard currency, as all the hard money has already been sucked out of the civilian economy by late 1916. The only source they have is to sell what was left in the old imperial gold reserves, which was only worth about 328 million rubles, while they were in billions of rubles in outstanding foreign debt. And after that, engage in a fire sale of state assets for newly minted rubles on the international markets for whatever they can get. Reason 3. With the Tsarist ministers directing most government policies that are slanted heavily in favor of the wealth due to weighed electoral laws that ensured laws favored capital and limited workplace reforms that could cut into profit, and secret police and interior troops that were willing to beat down any unrest and perpetrate purposefully tried to destroy or control the labor unions. Via paid agents or informants, Russia was very friendly to foreign capital and was able to plow extensive directed state investment into projects that encouraged economic expansion at the cost of limiting protection or compensation for the workers. This would work as long as brute force could be used against the ever-increasing numbers of strikes into submission and there was no promise of political change. But with the fall of the Tsarist government and its top-down means repressing labor and peasant militancy broke out in full force. Now adding the economic crash and flood of demobilizing soldiers who are no longer getting their necessities from the army, are far from home, find any savings they have are worthless, and have guns and know how to use them to this climate, and things are going to get ugly. The Entente won't help to try to stabilize the situation either, as they would in our timeline, but is actively going to try to take down the traitor government and get someone in power who is willing to fight Germany again, while the rural villages are going around in a populist seizure of privately held land and forcefully reintegrating it back into the highly in effect Obshchina structure. The provisional government won't have anyone to count on to restore stability. Reason 4. The notable increase in agricultural output, facilitated by gradual, if incomplete and widely unpopular consolidation and privatization of farmland under Stolypin's agricultural reforms, by allowing families to withdraw an allotment from the village communes as private land and making available cheap credit via state support for farmers to invest in land improvements or buy additional land. Russia was able to produce larger and more productive farms, mainly owned by the kulaks, who were later demonized by the Soviets. These kulaks produced a disproportionately large share of grain sold on the market, providing Russia not only with a major export commodity, but ensuring that prior to the war there was cheap, plentiful food to feed the rapidly growing urban population. This had broken down during the war, with the rail system having been overburdened, mismanaged, exposed to socialist strikes, the mass conscription of men that left the fields strapped for labour, much of which isn't coming back, and the rapid rate of inflation and shortage of civilian manufacturing that meant people were less willing to sell their crops for paper that rapidly became worthless. Then the peasants on the village communes, who made up the vast majority of the Russian population in large swaths of the country, came up to their fields after the revolution and began forcefully reintegrating the private holding into the communal structure for the far less efficient and labour-intensive process of dispersed strip farming, which means there's less food for Russia to either export or to get their hands on precious foreign reserves or gold, or to go into the shops in cities and towns, creating further price increases and shortages, which would just add to urban militancy. The final reason is to do with peripheral regions. Russia's not only economically desirable because of its core, many of its resources are in areas far from Petrograd, unlike in our timeline, where the Entente was interested in keeping most of these regions secure and under Russian control. Both sides have a vested interest in ripping Russia apart. Germany knows that if Russia tries to negotiate unilaterally after the February Revolution, they have them dead to rights, since they've just alienated any potential allies and turned any internal factions who want to continue the war against the civilian government. And while they may not get the whole Brest-Litovsk, their terms are going to be harsh and certainly not fit into the no annexations or indemnities standard even the most pro-peace Bolsheviks were pushing. Poland and the Baltic states were already firmly on the table. And the Central Council of Ukraine was already formed and rapidly assembling a national congress to declare autonomy from Russia, which is something Germany and the Habsburgs are perfectly fine supporting. Russia would have lost critical economic assets like its oil industry or easy access to the Siberian minerals that support its basic economic structure. These resources are already owned by foreign interests anyways, so investing for the joint goals of protecting property, suppressing the socialist uprisings around them, and providing self-determination in the face of an illegitimate government would be just enough for the era.